Have you ever noticed how we tell people to ask questions, but we don't really mean it? And the people who actually ask the questions are often the ones who get labeled as difficult or not the right fit. In this episode, we talk about why pretending or masking isn't a personal failure, but a survival strategy in systems where clarity feels risky and what that cost us over time, especially for neurodivergent people. Hi, I'm Dr. Theresa Haskins, and welcome to Think Differently, the podcast that challenges the status quo and explores the power of neurodiversity to create a more inclusive and accessible world. Together, we will talk about everything from the value of different perspectives to the limitless potential of human beings. We'll explore how embracing differences can lead to endless possibilities and how you can maximize strengths to make a positive impact on the world. So sit back, relax, and join me as we get ready to think differently. Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Think Differently. In the last episode, the first of the season, I talked about you should have known culture, the unwritten rules and the ambiguous expectations that tend to show up after something goes wrong and the harm has already occurred. This episode is kind of the prequel to that. What happens long before that moment? Because most people don't respond to unclear expectations by asking questions. Most people don't ask for clarity. They're not bold enough to say, could you be more specific about what you're asking of me? Or could you restate that idea? Or dare say, could you put that in writing? Instead, we pretend like we understand because everyone else is assumed to already understand, but they're also probably pretending too. They mirror what they see other people doing. They stay quiet in the hope that they'll figure it out later. And that isn't because people are disingenuous. It's because in a lot of environments, pretending that you understand, that you fit in, that you're comfortable, is just safer than asking. What's interesting is that research on psychological safety and learning environments consistently shows this exact behavior. When people perceive social or reputational risk, they default to silence and imitation. This means silence isn't always confidence. Sometimes it's risk assessment. We tell people all the time, in education, in the workplace, everywhere really, if you don't understand, just ask. People will say, does anybody have any questions? Or there's no such thing as a stupid question. But I'm going to be honest. That advice only works in systems where asking questions doesn't come with a cost, where asking a question doesn't carry reputational risk, where you might actually get an answer, not ridicule, judgment, or a quiet reassessment of your capability. In many systems, people say they want questions, but they react very differently when somebody actually asks one, especially if the question challenges the rationale behind how things are done or points out a flaw. There's a difference between asking, what time is the meeting tomorrow? Or asking, why are we making this change if we know it's going to be difficult for people? Both are questions, but they're not treated the same. What people learn, without anyone explicitly saying it, is which questions make you look capable and dependable, and which questions make you look like you just don't get it, you don't understand, or you don't quite fit how we do things around here. They also learn which questions are quietly penalized because they challenge authority or the soundness of the system. In other words, there are safe questions, and then there are those that are not. And once you learn that asking for clarity isn't actually safe, that it reflects back on you, pretending stops being accidental. It becomes a survival strategy. I want to be really clear here. Pretending, and yes, masking, isn't a failure of confidence. It isn't a lack of engagement. It's a learned response. And if anything, it means you're astute enough to read the environment and adapt. In autism research, masking is consistently described not as a preference, but as a survival mechanism, especially in environments where difference is tolerated only when it's invisible. Someone who masks is often doing a tremendous amount of work to fit in, as opposed to someone who can't mask and is seen as overtly idiosyncratic, which is a whole different conversation for another day. Pretending is a rational response to ambiguity, because in systems where expectations are unclear, rules are unwritten, and consequences for getting it wrong are unpredictable, the risk is real. If you get it wrong, will someone help you next time? Or will it be remembered and held against you as evidence of your capability and performance? When belonging, credibility, educational outcomes, or livelihood are at stake, people choose survival over clarity almost every time, even though clarity is what's actually needed to make survival sustainable. This is something neurodivergent people learn early in life, not because they're more anxious or less capable, but because we often take language seriously and expect people to mean what they say. When instructions are vague, norms are implied instead of stated, or people say one thing and do another, that ambiguity isn't abstract. It creates real cognitive load and real error risk. For autistic and ADHD individuals in particular, ambiguity increases executive load, meaning there's more energy spent interpreting context than actually doing the work. And over time, you start to notice that asking for clarification doesn't always lead to clarity anyway. Sometimes it leads to labels. They'll say the person is too literal. You ask too many questions. You're too slow. You're not ready. You're not a fit. So when people stop asking questions, it isn't because they don't care or everything's clear now. It's because they are paying attention to the messages being sent. Pretending can take many forms at school, at work, and yes, in families and relationships. It can look like nodding in meetings when you're not actually sure what's being decided. It can look like copying how others dress or speak, even when it feels unnatural. It can look like spending a disproportionate amount of time figuring out how to write an email so that it lands correctly. If you've ever spent a lot of time pre-scripting social or professional situations, stressing about what to wear or how to behave, that's not trivial. And I know I've done it more times than I can count. Sometimes pretending looks like staying silent until you're absolutely certain, because you don't want to speak out of turn or say the wrong thing. And that often means staying silent far longer than is helpful. Now, from the outside, this can look like competence, nodding, agreeing, over-preparing, being agreeable, not rocking the boat. And in many systems, that is rewarded. Leaders and teachers and organizations are very good at rewarding people who appear to understand and align with them. They're much less good at noticing who is quietly carrying the cognitive and emotional load of pretending. They don't see the 2 hours you spent figuring out what to wear and what to say for that 30-minute meeting. They don't see the extra preparation to just sound and look right. They don't see the energy it takes to manage perception instead of simply sharing accurate information. So pretending works. Masking works. It keeps you safe. It helps keep you employed. It keeps you from standing out. Until it doesn't. Because pretending is exhausting. It requires constant monitoring, constant self-editing, and constant calculation. And eventually something's going to give. People will disengage. They'll burn out. They'll make mistakes that look sudden but really aren't. Or they'll leave and everyone just says, I had no idea they were struggling. And what we see is that research on chronic cognitive load shows that people can compensate for a long time until they can't. It's like they hit a wall. Burnout often looks sudden because the compensation and effort behind it was invisible to everybody else. And that's because the systems, the people mistook silence or over-preparation for competence and understanding. This is where episode 1 and episode 2 connect. You should have known culture doesn't just blame people after something goes wrong. It teaches people long before that moment that it's safer to pretend than to be honest about uncertainty. And when that's the lesson, systems don't get better. They just get quieter and heavier. I want to pause here because this is not a call for people to stop pretending or masking tomorrow. That is not realistic and it's not fair. Most systems are not ready for people's full authentic selves, even though we say we want that. Pretending is often what allows people to pay the rent, finish school, keep a job, maintain relationships, and avoid being labeled in ways that follow them unfairly. So the problem isn't the pretending. The problem is the systems that make pretending necessary. If you're listening and thinking, oh my God, yes, I do that. No, there's nothing wrong with you. Every person, neurodivergent or not, does this at some point. The issue is when neurodivergent people have to do this not just occasionally, but everywhere, at work, at school, just to exist without friction. And what we know is sustained masking has been linked in neurodivergent adults to higher rates of anxiety, depression, and burnout. Not because of who they are, but because of what they're required to suppress. So the question, and this is where we'll keep going this season, is what happens when systems start relying on that adaptation instead of addressing the conditions that create the need for it? Because pretending works. Those who mask the best often win. But more and more people are hitting the wall. And it's not because people are different now. It's just culturally, we're more attuned to how we feel. We've raised a generation that was told their mental health matters. And once people can name the imbalance and the cost, it's hard to go backwards. And frankly, why should we? When the way we've always done things stops working, the only way forward is to do something different, because the cost is almost always carried by the individual, not the system. And that's where I want to stop today. And I want you to take a moment and ask yourself, where in my life do I feel safe being authentic? Where can I ask questions without fear? Where can I be honest? Not cruel, but transparent. And don't assume this is just about work and school. This could apply to any area of your life. If you find yourself constantly editing, modifying, holding yourself back, you might be managing yourself today. But at some point, every person needs a space where they're accepted as they are, imperfect, human, and whole. Thank you for listening to this episode of Think Differently. I hope you found our discussion today insightful and thought-provoking. I want to thank AudioWorks Studios for their exceptional production and recording support. Without their expertise and dedication, this podcast would not be possible. If you enjoyed this episode, we encourage you to share it with others. Your support helps us to reach new audiences and promote neurodiversity in our world. Also, be sure to subscribe to this podcast on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite platform so that you can stay up to date on the latest episodes. We look forward to seeing you again soon on Think Differently.